Καλησπέρα σας κυρίες και κύριοι και καλώς ήρθατε στη στέγη
ladies and gentlemen, and welcome for today's event, which is within the scope of events we've been holding on Kavafi. So we had a number of discussions and meetings, and this is, of course, tonight's event is just one in a series of many. We are also in charge of educational programs and projects in Greek schools, but we've also undertaken a number of actions and activities which will be unfolding throughout the year. For you see the foundation is hosting a number of events and initiatives. And this is not just on the occasion of the current year's anniversary, but we will actually be working on this subject matter for a number of years. Now, tonight we are graced by the presence of Daniel Mendelsohn and Dimitris Papanikolaou. Let me briefly introduce the two panelists. Daniel Mendelsohn was born on Long Island. He actually studied ancient Greek and Latin in Virginia and Princeton, Virginia University. He also has a PhD in classical studies. In 1991, at the time when he was about to complete his thesis on drama, he started writing articles in many magazines and journals such as The Village Voice. He wrote The Elusive Embrace back in 1999, and how beautiful it is and how easily it can be broken, which was written back in 2008. And these have received repeated awards. In 2006, he published a book for which he is mostly known, I guess, at least here in Greece, The Lost, The Search for 6 million, the chronicle of the reconstitution of history, the story of 6 relatives of the writer who were lost in the Holocaust. This was also yet another book that received many awards, and this book was published back in 2010 by Polis Publishing. For those of you who don't have it already, you will have a chance to get hold of it outside. In 2009, after 12 years of a long study and hard work, Daniel Mendelsohn published 2 volumes, including all the works of K.P. Kavafi, including his finished poems in English. This is the very first translation thereof. This publication is accompanied by analytical data and comments, and this was, just like I said before, the incomplete poems, conclusive of the incomplete poems. This received yet another award by Publishers Weekly, and yet again this book was a candidate for a British Critics Award. Daniel Mendelsohn is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's also a member of the American Society for Philosophy. He's taught at Princeton University. As of 2006, he is also teaching at Bard College. His interlocutor for tonight, Dimitris Papanikolaou, is a deputy professor for Greek Studies, Modern Greek Studies in St. Paul's in Oxford University. He's been teaching there as of 2004. He's been a student at the University of Athens and in London as well. He was a visiting professor and a researcher, and he's worked with NYU, Columbia, and Princeton University. In that capacity of his, he's written Thinking Poets, literature of popular music in French and Greece.
Καμωμένη, ο ομοφυλόφιλος Καβάφης και η ποιητική της σεξουαλικότητας, Πατάκης υποέκδοση. Ενώ αυτόν τον καιρό.
And at this point in time, he's actually completing a study and a survey on something's going on with the family, a nation, passion, lust, and relationships at the time of crisis. He's also worked as a journalist for a newspaper on the BBC. He's a member of and follows publishing team, and he's also publishing the Greek Media Culture magazine. He also often publishes articles in Avyi. In tonight's event, they're going both to talk about Kavafi's work, and they are going to highlight the multifaceted character thereof along with its significance. Thank you.
Μια μεγάλη ευχαριστία και από μένα.
A big thanks on my part as well. Thank you for being here tonight. I will use the Greek language for a while, and then I'm going to revert in English because I'm going to have a discussion with Mr. Mendelsohn in English. And I know that many of us are watching us through the internet, and I'm sure that you know who Daniel Mendelsohn is. And then again, I guess you are also Kavafi plans. More than again, I guess you know that what you're about to witness is a discussion on the poet, the relationship of Kavafi with us and others. And we're going to talk about the role of Kavafi poetry in our own lives. And in due course, we're going to talk about the literature, history, the cultural, ethnic, and erotic identity of translation poetry. Just like you heard before, this is yet another event that is being hosted by the Onassis Foundation on the occasion of the Kavafi year. And then again, the acquisition of the relevant records and files from the foundation. This Kavafi cycle aims at bringing the poet to the forefront along with his work and his historical and literary mark. It's multitudinous readings, not just by experts and specialists, but by lay people around the globe, since many of us have related with such poetry. And so it is for this big poet of time, of lust, of desire, of loss in the world, we are going to have a discussion today. And it's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be joined on stage by Daniel Mendelsohn. He is a man that has influenced many of us, especially the young researchers and scholars, people that are trying to somehow connect our academic background and our interests and hobbies with our publications and public articles. Daniel Mendelsohn is one of these people that teaches people how to bring together proper reading and translation, philology, and everyday life. And at least this is how I perceive Daniel Mendelsohn, and he's also influenced me in that sense. You heard about his work in Kavafi. He's been working in Kavafi for a number of years. I've been impressed by the outcome of Mendelsohn's work, and moreover, I've been impressed due to the fact that this is something that shows a certain sense of intensity and tension that's always beyond me. I remember when I first read the translated poems that were published in magazines and journals, and I found out back then that he was about to publish more poems, and then I read more poems, and I knew about the forthcoming publication of all the Kavafi poems, including the incomplete ones, unfinished ones, that is. And quite often, Daniel Mendelsohn refers to Kavafi in his work. It's as if Daniel Mendelsohn is a poet that keeps going back and coming back to Kavafi. So this is where I would like to start from. And on that point, let me revert in English.
You understood that it seems to me that Kavafi for you is a poet, not a poet that you once turned to or a poet that you once translated, but a poet that you like to return to. And for many of us, it's been such a significant poet as well. Mm-hmm. I'm asking both a personal and a more general question. Why Kavafi? Why Kavafi?
Why Kavafi? I think, to my mind, Kavafi is a necessary poet. I think on two levels. I don't say this of every poet, but I think there are some poets who are necessary poets. I think to read Kavafi, to be intimate with Kavafi, is to enhance the inner life in a personal way. No poet that I can think of in any language that I know of is as interested in, I would say, the effect of time and one's relationship to time in the course of one's own life. And for the same reason, I think that Kavafi is a necessary poet on a larger level. I will do my very best to avoid saying the national level, but on a cultural level, I would say, that the same preoccupation with time, with the perspective that time gives to a person or a nation or a culture, allows us to think about our own experience as members of a civilization in a very meaningful way. I will add to that the obvious observation that I am an American experiencing Kavafi. I think that doesn't prevent me from experiencing Kavafi in a deep way, but there are obvious ramifications of what I just said as a poet who's interested in time and culture, specifically for Greeks. And I know that we will come to that subject shortly. But to me, the answer to why Kavafi, as I say, is nobody thinks harder about the way we relate to the passage of our own lives than Kavafi does. And that has implications both, I would say, personal and psychological on the one hand, and cultural and civilizational, if there is such a word, on the other. And there are many other poets that I love, but I think that Kavafi is very important in a way that even those poets are not so important.
It's interesting, isn't it? There is a Greek critic who has once said that every single period, every time, reads Kavafi as if it is their own, that is, as if it is a contemporary poet. So the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 70s, the year 2000, read Kavafi as if it is a poet writing now.
Well, because, Kavafi can be read by every era as if he were writing both for and about that era, because that is his subject, right? That is precisely his subject, which is both everything changes and everything remains the same, right? This is what he sees over and over again in the passage of time, in the passage of the time of one's own life, but also in the passage of the time of the lives of entire nations. Because, it is, I think I can safely say, it will never be the case that there will come an era in the history of humankind in which Kavafi turns out to be wrong, right?
And is this because he was clever enough to avoid taking sides, or?
Well, I always sort of make the same joke, which is that history is really the study of human nature, and people never change. So that's something that he understands.
And, okay, I can see why an American intellectual and a critic at that is fascinated by Kavafi. I can see it in your example. But how come an American boy finds Kavafi suddenly? I understand you first read Kavafi a long time ago. And that was always my question. How come you found Kavafi out? How come Kavafi found you? I don't know.
Well, there's a funny story behind this. I found Kavafi twice. I read Kavafi in college. I should say, first of all, that to Americans, I think Kavafi is an important poet. I think people tend to know one Greek literary figure in the United States, and that will be Kavafi. Partly it's because of Ithaki, but not totally because of Ithaki. So I think probably at university I read some poems. Certainly Perimenodas τους Βάρβαρους, because I was already a classics major in university. So you think, oh my gosh, there's this Greek guy and he's writing poems about the ancient world. How wonderful is that, But then, I don't know, it didn't sort of get to me until much later. And then what happened is Kavafi and I found each other in a very peculiar way much later. You've heard this story.
This doesn't mean that I don't want the others to hear it.
But
it's a great story.
In the late 1980s, I was a graduate student in classics, and I was doing the program at the Americano Scholio, up in Kolonaki. And this is the period in my life when I realized I had no interest whatsoever in being an archaeologist. And because every morning you wake up at 4 in the morning and you have to climb to the top of a mountain to look at a Mycenaean beehive tomb. And they all look exactly the same. And so I had only brought a couple of books with me, which I read over and over, and at a certain point I started to have intellectual starvation. And we were driving across the Peloponnesos in a bus, and we all got off in Tripolis to make a pee-pee stop. And I went into like a Pantopolion or something desperately, and I said to the guy, I said, I have got to get a book. Any book, I don't care what it is, a comic book even, because I'm going to go mad if I have to look at one more broken pot. And the only book that he had was Kavafy's, and he gave it to me. He wouldn't let me give him money. I remember it was an old copy of Kavafy's, and I started then. I didn't even know Greek, really. I had just started to learn a little bit of Greek, and I started memorizing one poem every day, just to keep my mind from dying, basically. And that's how we found each other. As I always like to say, he may not saved my life, but he certainly saved my brain. So it became sort of part of my mental furniture at a very crucial moment, I think. And then that was it. Then what happened is I was studying. So then I decided I wanted to really learn Greek while I was at graduate school, and there was a wonderful, wonderful professor I had at Princeton, where I was a graduate student, called Richard Burgi. And he, being old-fashioned, made us memorize poems as we were learning Greek. So imagine, we were in the first week of Greek. Nobody even knew how to say Kalimerasas. And we were memorizing Kavafi also. So there were sort of funny moments in my life when Kavafi kept coming up. But by then, I think I had the correct mental apparatus to appreciate Kavafi. By the time I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I think Kavafi is a poet for grown-ups. And you have to be grown up to appreciate it, I would say. So I think at a certain point, I was ready for Kavafi by that point.
Why do we do that? Why would someone want to find a book to save their mind from going crazy?
Well, it was interesting because, many kids who fall in love with ancient Greece, you're an American kid, and so why do you fall in love with ancient Greek? Naked statues and dirty stories. It's like, gosh, our God is so well behaved, Look at the fun they had. I was, at a very early age, interested in ancient Greece and mythology, and I thought archaeology, everybody wants to find a tomb. But I realized on this American school program that objects were not so interesting to me. But then I had 9 weeks where all you did is look at objects. And I thought, I had this sort of revelation. I thought, oh, I'm a text person, not an object person. And it was funny that I went that long without realizing that, but I wanted text. That's what I wanted.
I'm saying this because often I'm trying to find out why Kavafi exerts that influence and is liked so much by students. Every time you go into a class and you throw a text to students, they are fascinated. And one of the things that he's a poet who makes you think constantly and invest time, energy, feeling in interpreting, in reading and reading again. And to my mind, this is an important function of literature. Not only an aesthetic function, but also keeping you interested, alive, awake, invested in a piece of text. And also, I mean, it's interesting that we always think of Kavafi as reworking his texts, picking them, putting them together, preparing them for publication, changing them after they were published, republishing. And somehow it replicates that relationship we want to have with a book or with a text. I don't know if you agree with that. Is that the reason he keeps being so fascinating to people?
Yes, I think Kavafi is fascinating to people in a way that's quite different from the way that other poets are. It's a very hard quality to describe, you know. And here I hate to quote the famous, you know, E.M. Forster description, standing at an angle to the universe, and yet there's a great wisdom in there. You know, Kavafi, I don't know about angle, but there's a sense of Kavafi that one responds to very strongly, which is that he's looking at everything not in the same way that anybody else is looking at everything. Now, of course, every poet is like that. But Kavafi, you know, Kavafi liked the shady corners. Geographically, he likes places, you know, when you study the classics, as I did, you know, most people are interested essentially in two places, Athens and Rome. What's so interesting about Kavafi when you first discover him is how interested he is in every other place in antiquity. Antioch, you know, obviously Alexandria, the sort of funny places where Greek culture ended up thriving, you know. So there's a sort of geographic strangeness, right? He reminds you that Greek culture was happening everywhere, not just in Athens, not even just Alexandria, Libya, funny places. Temporally, I would say, and again, I'm saying as a person with a perspective with a typical classical education, he's interested in sort of everything but the classical period. When I went to graduate school, I was essentially a literature person, but we had to take an examination in ancient history. And I remember one of the older graduate students telling me, "Don't worry, you don't have to know anything about the Hellenistic period." He said, because they all have the same names and nobody can keep them straight. And you know, it's so interesting that, of course, that's the period that Kavafi is interested in, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, what we call late antiquity now, which wasn't even a sort of business when I was in graduate school. It wasn't even something people were interested in. The 5th century, the 6th century AD, of course, Byzantium. And if you're an Anglophone reader, you have the terrible problem that is the inheritance from Gibbon, which is, the English way of looking at Byzantium, which is, oh, too bad, there was this 1,000-year period which we're just going to ignore. So, and of course, Kavafi is obsessed with Byzantium. So one could say historically or chronologically or temporally, he's interested in what nobody else was interested in, And then, of course, we come inevitably to the subject of Eros, right? As a homosexual person living in a city which was then sort of on the edge of the European experience, he's going to have another way in which his perspective is different from everybody else's perspective. So I think all of these things layer on top of one another to give him a view that is not like the view of anybody else. Now, why do we care about this? We care about this because whoever you are, you're Greek, I'm American, you're straight, I'm gay, blah, blah, it doesn't matter because everyone, I would say, look, everyone feels like they're on the edge in some way, different, special, marginalized, blah, blah, blah. So Kavafi, I think, allows everyone to feel like they have been understood in some way. I think that has a big part of his popular appeal. You know,
I think you're saying this to the right audience. This audience understands very well what it means to say that everyone feels what it means to be on the edge or precarious, especially at this moment.
Yes, right. So I think that, you know, it's just, you know, people always talk about the tone of voice of Kavafi, the personality of Kavafi. You know, it's all true. I think when we talk about Kavafi, it's funny, you know, when you talk about certain poets, you think of certain poems. And I think when you think about Kavafi, quite often you think about a personality. And I don't mean the personality of a person. I mean a group of ideas, a way of seeing things. And I think people feel attached to him because of that, you know.
Recently, you organized an event in New York, and I understand it's there where Orhan Pamuk spoke. He then wrote his text, and he writes something that's very interesting. He says, even though Kavafi makes no explicit reference to himself in his best and most stirring work, yet with every poem we read, we cannot help but thinking of him. And you've just done this now. Why this? Why do we go back always to this person, to those photographs, to these moments of life that we don't even know very well?
Well, you know, if I knew the answer to that, I would be a much smarter person. But I think it's interesting. Well, you know, what I do think of when you say that is how many poets I know who you know, Kavafi is the poet's poet. All American poets, Anglo-Saxon poets, everyone knows Kavafi, right? He's teaching people something about their own work, which I think is interesting. But again, I think partly, you know, I want to talk about a quality of Kavafi, which I call the loneliness of Kavafi. And again, I want to make a distinction. I'm talking about a sort of personality. I'm not talking about the man, who seemed to have been quite entertaining and interesting and had interesting friends. But the fact that he's off on his own, doing his own thing, and he really doesn't care about what anyone else is doing. And that, you know, if you're a writer, I think in particular you have great admiration for that, because it's very hard not to care what other people are doing, you know, looking over your shoulder all the time. And I think this is why poets like him, because you always feel when you read Kavafi that he absolutely didn't care what anyone else was doing. He was making these poems that were not like anything else that anybody ever wrote. And he really didn't care. He didn't care if anyone read them, as we know, because if you work on Kavafi, you know, the story of Kavafi's self-publication and it's so unlike any other poet. He doesn't care. He gives his poems to people that he thinks, you know, will appreciate them. That is something that I don't think anyone else I can think of ever did. So he really doesn't care. And so even though we know, or we can imagine, that in his personal life there were disappointments, there were frustrations, blah, 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 there has to be a remarkable kind of strength in a writer who absolutely has no concern for what any other person in his business is doing.
You know,
and that has to give you strength as a writer, but I think it also gives us strength as people when we read him. That's what you feel. I will persist. I may lose the battle, I may not publish the poem, I'll lose the boyfriend, the affair is over, the civilization is ended, but I go on. And how could you not respond to that?
I find this, you know, the amazing thing. He didn't care what the others would say. He didn't care about what was happening in the literary events around him, even though he knew, and he gets information when he wants information. So he doesn't care. But on the other hand, this is a poetry that is very much about caring.
Yeah.
And this is the amazing thing. I mean, this poet who doesn't care, as you said, is also writing these most wonderful poems about caring for the other. Yeah. I remember the last poem he published while he was alive is Days of 1908, which for me is the most important poem of caring for the other, not only to touch, to like, to love, to appreciate, but also to tell the other's story.
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting part of Kavafi, actually, is what I called Cavafy's ventriloquism. You know, it's very interesting in Kavafi, the way that he speaks for the objects of his admiration quite often, right? You know, there's all these poems that take the, you know, all these poems which take the form of tombstones. You know, there's a very interesting thing that goes on in Kavafi. Who gets to speak? You know, quite often, if it's poems about these handsome young men who have died at a very early age, you know, in a funny way, they only get to speak when they're dead, which I think is rather interesting. But I think you're right. I think that this is on the one hand, he doesn't care what other people are saying, but I mean that in the sense that he doesn't care about literary fashion. You know, the writers he cares about are historians, and that's very important. He has tremendous admiration, respect for historians and the writing of history. And that is why, you know, when he describes himself as a pitis historikos, he has tremendous respect for history, and it's a part of him that you have to acknowledge. You know, how does history get written? Who gets to write the history? Is there an alternative version? You know, many of Cavafy's poems depend for their effect precisely on the difference between the official history that you're reading or that somebody wrote and the facts or the history as we know it to have happened. He is deeply aware of the ironies of history, right? That history, as we know, often gets written by the winners. But as we also know, Kavafi is mostly interested in the losers. So already he has a very interesting approach to history. But I would say the writers he does care about are historians. And that's why I think you have to take that very seriously when you read Kavafi.
It seems to me not only does he appreciate historians, but he has his own theory of historiography. He seems to be the poet of historiography rather than history, right?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, it's interesting, and I know because you like this poem so much, how many of Cavafy's poems present themselves as historical inscriptions, historical texts, quotations. Look at Ana Komnini, right? Where you get someone is quoting the text of the Alexiad, whoever, and it says, well, Ana Komnini says blah, 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 blah. But then the narrator of the poem is saying something quite different. So I don't know of any other poet who is that interested in the tension between history that gets written and maybe there's another story that you're not getting, you know. I would say people always talk about T.S. Eliot, but T.S. Eliot is completely different. It's completely different, you know. So it's interesting.
Why does he go so much back to the ancient periods, the various kind of periods in antiquity, but to the classical, post-classical, the ancient Greek, Hellenistic period? Is it because he's Greek?
Well, you know, it's interesting because, of course, I would say maybe it's not so much because he's Greek, because, of course, being Greek in the 19th century is already a complicated thing, and he's an Alexandrian. So already it's different. I think it's because he had a deep feeling for Alexandria and a deep feeling for Constantinople. And I think, I mean, I try to imagine as an Alexandrian, and I know we have Alexandrians in the audience tonight, you know, what it must be like to grow up in a city that you know well was the center of the world, and now is at the edge of the world, so to speak. And that gives you an interesting double vision. So when you grow up with that, you see the possibilities of every era of history, right? You realize every place was somebody's center once. And so it makes you alive to the possibilities of, then you start looking at other places, you know, I don't know, Antioch, strange places that most graduate students in history never even heard of. And you think, well, everything was a center once. And I think that double perspective is what makes him interested in history in that way. You know, he's aware that, look, this is the point of, you know, we talked about this, the point of so many Cavafian poems is, and it's both the historical poems, then we'll talk about personal poems too, pospera Santa Chronia, right? That happens to cities and it happens to people.
I find it very interesting that you just said that it's not because of an effort to show stability, but in order to show fluidity, that he goes back to those periods. Yeah. And it's good to underline that sometime. It's not because he feels stable in an identity, not because he feels stable. He wants to show people in stable identities and in stable moments in history, but in fluid moments.
No, I think he's very aware that identity is very fluid, you know, and of course the identity that he's most interested is what it means to be Greek. But what does it mean? So we can say, oh, the Acropolis, whatever. But he sees the whole picture. He sees the Acropolis, he sees the 3rd century BC, he sees the 2nd century BC, he sees the 1st century BC, he sees the Hellenistic kingdoms falling apart as Rome rises, then he sees Rome fall, then he sees Byzantium rise. So when you have the long view, then what does it mean to be Greek? He sees, most importantly, I think, for Kavafi, he sees paganism yielding to Christianity. And that's why so many of his poems are interested in, you know, who are the real Greeks in the 4th century AD, right? His complete contempt for the Emperor Julian, I think, is an object lesson. You know, Julian thinks he's the real Greek because he wants to go backwards, but the Antiochenes, he really thinks are more Greek. Even though they're now Christian, he thinks they're more Greek than the guy who wants to worship the old gods. That's what's so interesting about Kavafi, it seems to me. It's his appreciation of the fluidity and the multiplicity of what Greek identity can mean over 3 millennia. You know, I think that's a wonderful thing.
I think there
I would love to be Greek just because of that. You know?
I think there we very much find ourselves in agreement. There seems to be no identity in Kavafi that's a finished project.
No.
I don't think. Well, not even erotic identity is ever a finished project. But certainly not Greekness, not homosexuality. It seems that identities are there and constantly negotiated. But I don't know if I'm using now a kind of very much contemporary discourse to present something that is much earlier. But
well, but I think it's true. I think it's also true for individual identity in Kavafi, erotic identity. Look, I think I have to imagine that as a homosexual person living when he did, he was all too familiar with the necessity to wear masks. It's interesting, I noticed this, I was teaching a Kavafi seminar just this year, and it's very interesting, his interest in the theater, how often theaters come up in his work, and the sort of the metaphor of the actor, like in King Demetrius.
And performance, right, and performative acts that...
I think that's interesting. You know, he knows what it is to play a role, not always because one wants to, I would say. But this, again, so this provides a personal insight, right? We do this in our lives, but of course it provides him with tremendous historical insight as well. It gives him insight into the way that characters in history have acted, so, you know, in every sense of the word acted. Yeah.
You said you were teaching for the first time, I understand. You were teaching this year, Kavafi course, right?
Yes. I worked on the translation for 12 years, but I never taught it. And I'm very happy I taught it. Because you learn so much from your students. It's amazing, you know.
Did they tell you anything you had never thought about?
Every week. I taught this course once a week for 2.5 hours, and every week I couldn't wait to get to the classroom because I was the one who was learning. And that's the wonderful I mean, this is a cliche, but you know, when you teach, because they're reading it maybe for the first time. So they see something that you've been looking at for 12 years, and they say one thing, and you think, oh my God, that completely changed my whole idea. What kids said to me, speaking of days of 1908, right? So at the end of the poem, he's looking, I think, far away at this young man at the beach, this beautiful young man. He's taken off his clothes, he's going for a swim naked at the beach, and he takes off the mended underwear. What's the line? Well, and my students, so I've read this poem 1,000 times, and you have the impression when you read the poem that he's, as one often does in one of these Kavafian poems, where he's watching, you know, watching a boy walk by. Do you want the line? Pardon?
Do you want the line?
Yeah.
No. I'll read it in Greek. I suppose you want the last 5 lines of the poem.
Yeah.
Okay. Καμιά εβδομάδα, ενίοτε πιο πολύ, σε γλίτωνε από το φρικτό ξενύχτη, δροσίζονταν στα μπάνια, στο κολύμβι το πρωί. Τα ρούχα του είχαν ένα χάλι τρομερό. Μια φορεσιά την ίδια πάντοτε έβαζε, μια φορεσιά πολύ ξεφοριασμένη, κανελιά. Μέρες του καλοκαιριού του 1908. Από το είδωμά σας...
Oh, summer days of 1908. From your perspective, the cinnamon brown suit was tastefully excluded. Your perspective has preserved him as he was when he threw off those unworthy clothes, the mended underwear, and stood stark naked, impeccably handsome, a miracle. His hair uncombed, swept back, his limbs a little tanned from his morning nakedness at the basin on the beach.
And my student says, so how many times have I read this poem, and how long did I, and my student said, you know, you have to get awfully close to see that the underwear is mended.
Yeah.
I never thought of that in my entire life. And I thought, how brilliant is that? You know, it gave me, because you think, you know, you have a sort of cinematic image of this thing, and I thought, that's great. That's why you teach. That's why you teach. Because you're the prisoner of your own brain, and you're so happy, you know. And now, you know, so of course, the other thing that happens when you teach, you want to run back and fix every translation, you know, because you think,
Which will bring me back to translation, because we've already discussed about Kavafi as a poet of time, of difference, of distance, of fluidity, of care, of textuality. And this is the moment where we will discuss Kavafi in translation. And I always was wondering, you know, there must be 5, 6, 7 translations of Kavafi in print at the moment, or have been in print in the last 30 years. Why does someone feel the need to retranslate Kavafi? Why? How did you start? How did you start this project? Translate Kavafi again.
Well, it was, you know, like everything else, an accident. Basically, what happened was I had a friend who was a photographer in New York, and he said he wanted to make a series of photographs based on Kavafi. In my experience, that never has a happy ending. But I was, you know, by then I was interested in Kavafi. I was just out of graduate school. I had done my PhD, but I had decided I wanted to be a writer. I had moved to New York, and I was writing and doing journalism. And I thought, oh, this will be so interesting. So this photographer said he didn't like any of the existing translations into English, and he knew that I was interested in Kavafi's. So he said, would you translate 20 poems? And and my grandmother used to say, man plans and God laughs. So I, in my naivete, said, oh, this will be so interesting and fun, like doing the crossword puzzle, sort of. And I said, yes, this is an interesting. So I spent some time doing it. And what happened was finally there was, and I already had some ideas about what a translation into English that I would be interested in doing, what were the emphases that I was interested in. Because, of course, there's a wonderful translation already of Mike Keeley, Edmund Keeley, and Ray Dalvin. They were the two in current translation. And so what happened was there was an opening night, a vernissage of the photographs, which we best not talk about. And there was an editor who read my translations, and she's a poetry editor at a publishing house. She used to actually publish as Ann Carson, we were talking about the other night. And she said, oh, there hasn't been a new translation of Kavafi in 30 years, which at that point was true. I took so long to do my translation that by the time it came out, there had been 4 new translations in the intervening years. But I realized, so there were 2 things that happened. Because of the way which I have already explained to you about how I learned Kavafi, which was in the ear, I had a sound in my head that I wanted to try to reproduce in English. There's a cliche about Kavafi that he's prosaic, which I do not find at all in the Greek, which has a strong and wonderful rhythms and many rhymes and many formal devices, all kinds of things. So that was my interest. And I would stress again here, as I always like to do, translations are not in competition with each other. They are in collaboration with each other. I think that's very important. So, when you focus on one thing in a translation, you have to leave out something else. You can't do everything. It's impossible. So if you're interested in rhyme, you're going to lose a little bit of sense, but you have to make a call about what's more important to you. So things like that. Then at a certain point, early on, I thought that for English language readers of Kavafi, precisely because he is interested in history in a way that is unique among important poets, there needed to be a full commentary. People, for several reasons, people today, with the education that people have today, are not nearly as familiar with the ancient world as they once were. Pospera Santa Chronia. And so I thought the historical poems needed to be elucidated fully. Because, quite often in a Kavafian poem, there are about history, let's say, there are so many levels of irony that you need to tease out that unless you know what the history actually was, you sort of don't get the poem, I think. And then, but not just that, because there has been such important scholarly work in the past years that I wanted to sort of synthesize that to some extent. So an American reader of this book could pick up a poem, whether it's a historical poem or a philosophical poem or an erotic poem, and have some sense of where they were. Now, you can read the translation without the commentary, that's fine. But I come out of a philological tradition, and I love the idea of a commentary, So that took a long time. When that's sort of, I think, when I became serious and I understood. And I wanted to present Kavafi in a certain way. So that's why it took so long.
I remember when you were doing that, and there were rumors spreading across campuses, that you were doing the Kavafi translations and that you've translated a new poem, and even I've heard about translations before you ever published them. Like people you had read them to had told me. I remember everybody commenting not so much on the commentary, but that you were preparing, but on the rhythm and the way you were trying to get this across. And I know that many critics appreciated that very much. How much is being lost of Kavafi in a translation? I know it's a cliché question, but more than other poets, less? Is he an easy poet to translate, to get the right message across?
That's a question you should not ask somebody who spent 12 years translating. No, but I know what you mean, of course. I mean, I think, every poet is different. Kavafi, on the one hand, there's, I won't say easy, but there are certain kinds of things you don't have to worry about in Kavafi. There are certain kinds of poetic figures that he's completely uninterested in. Metaphors. I can think of maybe one metaphor in Kavafi. The certain kinds of problems of language. I think the biggest challenge to an English language translator of Kavafi is the katharevusa. We just don't have anything like that. And I think that is really, there is a thing I tried to do, which sometimes I think sort of works better than other times, but we don't have anything like the difference between Dimotiki and Katharevusa. We just don't. And so that's something you lose, basically, I haven't translated any other poets, so I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, there are other Greek poets that I read. I personally would never want to have to translate Elitis. I don't even know how people do it. That's a different kind of project.
Well, yet again, another poet, literary figure in America has done that, Olga Brumas, and she has a personal perspective on Elitis, doesn't she? I don't know if
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Olga Brumas has done that in English. She has translated Elitis into English, no? Yeah. I
have nothing but admiration. One of the things that's great about translating, because every translation eventually becomes passé, but I'll tell you the great thing about translating is there is no relationship more intimate than the relationship that you develop with a writer that you love as a translator. It forces you to try to penetrate so deeply, because there are times where you have to imagine, what was he thinking? Which, of course, is a sort of hubristic question. But, you have to go so intimately. And that's, whatever else happens, that's what the translator takes away.
I was at Princeton in 2007, and I remember someone who told me, you had just read your translations in public months before. I went there, and I remember someone over coffee saying, you know what, the last two lines of Entomimia Thir in Greek go something like «Με φαίνεται που ο Λεύκιος μεγάλος θα αγαπήθη, Entomimia Thir, ο Λεύκιος εκοιμήθη». And that student actually remembered your translation over coffee, and he says out to me, and he said, in love, it seems to me, Lefkios was greatly blessed. In the month of Hathor, Lefkios went to his rest. And, you know that something is happening when people are discussing a translation about to be published. And I think it is something to do with this poet, who drives us all in, who makes us all invested, all talk about this oeuvre, this work with such great interest, personal interest, be it somebody translating Kavafi, somebody publishing a new reading of Kavafi. Everybody seems like very, very anxious to find out more about it and to invest more time in reading those things.
People care.
People care, and it seems to be we go around these words for the right reason. Your translations are the first which include in published form in a book the ateli ποίηματα, the poems that were found in the Kavafi archive, unfinished, and were then edited and published by Renata Lavanini. So you're the first who have translated those poems. And I have two questions about that. The first question is, what kind of poems are they? They seem to be, some of them, quite different from everything else we know of Kavafi, or not, your view?
Well, I think, one must always begin with the caveat that one is talking about unfinished work. So it's already a problem. Then again, what the word unfinished meant to Kavafis, as we know, there was one poem that, as far as we can tell, he didn't consider finished because he couldn't find the patristic source for the story that he narrates in the poem about the Emperor Julian, the death of the Emperor Julian. So that's one definition of unfinished, which tells you a lot about Kavafi's scrupulousness as a person interested in history. He felt he couldn't release this poem because he couldn't find the original source. Many of them obviously are closer to what we think of as unfinished. There are many drafts, different readings. I mean, these poems, as one would imagine, give us great insight into aspects of Kavafi that we would not have had they not been edited and published. For example, we had a couple of poems about Ioannis Kantekouzenos, but there were more of the unfinished drafts about him. So it turns out that there's a sort of little cycle of poems written about the same time, which I, in my commentary, said was not accidental, that it was during the Greco-Turkish War. And so you begin to, they allow you to understand things about him. There's some more Julian poems. So it fills out your vision. What they would have been had they been finished and published in the form that he finished them, we will never know. But I do think, and because the question arises inevitably about the ethics of publishing unfinished
that would have been the second question.
Work, and this is a personal, I'm not Moses laying down the law for the people. I think in the case of great writers, the great writers they belong to the people, right? They belong to the world. So, if you told me today, right, to use maybe a clarifying analogy, that someone had found 4 unfinished plays of Euripides with a note from Euripides that said, don't publish these plays, right? At a certain point, great literature and great poets, I think that's my own feeling. So, and Kavafi, and I say this as somebody, who understands that Kavafi had extremely strong ideas about which of his poems should be circulated, poems that he considered finished but should not be circulated, So even knowing that, I think that Lavanini, who labored on this, was correct to release them. I think whatever there is, Kavafi is great, and therefore he belongs to the world. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Again, I want to emphasize, this is how I feel about great poets. That's my feeling.
I think more and more now people realize that Kavafi is not only the poet of the 154 poems, it's also the poet who has written other things that were left unpublished, were published afterwards, or were left unfinished. He's also the poet of the constant archiving, the archive, the Kavafi archive, which, let's take it in a much broader sense. It includes from lists to unpublished stuff, from other people writing in, if we take the archive with a capital A, the Kavafi archive, is also something that Kavafi very much was in the center of from the beginning. He is somebody who constantly archived his things, who constantly was preoccupied with keeping notes, with keeping even a note of who he sent things to and how.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting part of this very textual body of work.
Yes.
Which I think more and more has come to the center of not only the scholarly reading of Kavafi, but a reading of Kavafi that's much broader and, more people are interested in.
Absolutely. But this is why I think, precisely as you said, because Kavafi himself cared so much. When you look at the atelier, the presentation of the atelier, he
that's the story,
had these these dossiers with pieces of paper. Well, he was writing poems on cigarette boxes and envelopes, and he kept them so carefully.
And
I think
guys,
for that reason...
If you haven't bought the atelier yet and you go tomorrow and buy them, the story is in the notes, is in the various different drafts, is in the photographs of the notebooks. The story is there. There's a whole story of writing and of spending time and of putting one's life in that project.
Yes, and that's why I believe, and again, this is because I come out of a philological tradition, that the utmost responsibility, I would say, of the archive is to properly organize, catalog, publish the archive. That's the number one priority. It has to be done by serious people, serious scholars. That's, you know this, one knows this so well as a classical. You go to the library, to my beloved former Eleftheroudakis, as I used to go, and you buy this Antigone of Sophocles, and you open it, and you're so happy to be reading the Antigone of Sophocles. What you are reading is the product of the work of invisible philologists who have labored for centuries and decades, taking illegible manuscripts, fragments of papyrus, the erudition that one has to have to do that. So you read the book in Eleftheroudakis, right? But what you're really reading is the work of scholars as well as the work of Sophocles. And that's why I think in the case of Kavafi, like every other great writer, the first priority is establish the text, publish. It's a great thing to have the archive, publish, catalog, let the scholars do their work, because you can't even talk about Kavafi without their work, right? So that, to me, is the most important thing.
And I think everybody's in agreement with that. You said before, teaching Kavafi, we both have had this experience. You always hear new things you never have thought of, even for poems you have been thinking about for such a long time. That reminds to me one such moment in my life. I sometimes teach that poem Κρυμμένα, Hidden Things, to students, and I don't know how many of you know this poem. Is this one that starts, it is a poem that was unpublished during the poet's lifetime, written in 1908, and it starts with «Από όσα έκαμα και πόσα είδα να μην ζητήσουν να βρουν ποιος είμαι, και από όσα είπα, από όσα έκανα και από όσα είπα να μην ζητήσουν να βρουν ποιος είμαι». And it goes on. In the end it says, κάποτε στην τελειωτέρα κοινωνία κανένας άλλος θα βρεθεί, κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα θα βρεθεί και ελεύθερα θα κάμει. And I have, I think, to repeat that in order to say it, properly. Κάποτε στην τελειωτέρα κοινωνία κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα θα βρεθεί και ελεύθερα θα κάμει. There was this one student once who was gay, and who said, you know what, you read that phrase and it obviously means at another time, in the more perfect society, there will be somebody else who will certainly appear and act freely. But if you read it in Greek, it says, κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα, βέβαια θα φανεί και ελεύθερα θα κάμει. Before the line changes, Κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα sounds like a shout, a cry. There is nobody else like me. And the boy said, you know what, I have felt like that. And I once read Kavafi. I have felt that there was nobody else like me. And I was lonely, and I had felt that there was nobody else like me. And then the line goes on, and because of the Greek, there's a double negation. Κανένας άλλος καμωμένος σαν και εμένα, it means somebody else. Then, when you read the next line. And which brings me to the question that you know I want to ask, and I feel you may also want to be asked. Have you seen people who have read Kavafi also trying to find out more about a gay perspective, who have come to Kavafi because they are gay, because they feel like that, because they have felt that nobody else was like that, and suddenly they realized this was not the case?
I'm very happy that we finally recognized the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
I had to go round a long circle to get to it.
I am aware that there has been some controversy lately about the extent to which Kavafi's homosexuality ought to be, whatever you want to call it, emphasized, de-emphasized, re-emphasized, over-emphasized, whatever. Certainly, there are people, and I know people, who turned to Kavafi because they were gay and they found a kindred spirit. And I just want to open up a tiny little parenthesis here, which is one of these insights that you get for the first. It's very interesting about the poem Krimena, because one of the very few poems in Kavafi that imagines the future.
Yep.
It's very striking. It just sort of hit me, because one is always sort of thinking about the past.
Kavafi as a poet.
To imagine, one day there will be. So I think that's so interesting. Certainly, many people I know found Kavafi because they needed to find a voice that was telling a story that was a story that they recognized about being gay desire, frustrated, people meeting in the night and never seeing each other again. Obviously, and I would add here as a personal footnote that although that wasn't quite my story with Kavafi, which you've already heard, it's very difficult in this day and age, which is more open, and there's things on television, and there's things, movies, whatever. Even when I was an adolescent, the gay adolescent, it was impossible to imagine that there was anyone else in the world made like you were, right? So I think that is very important to recognize. And so much of Kavafi's erotic poems are precisely about the phenomenon of sort of people passing and exchanging glances on a stairway and trying to see, is he thinking what I'm thinking? That is certainly part of the project. And
recognition.
Pardon?
Recognition, saying there will be another one like me, and they have to find out.
Or there won't be.
Out.
So I think many people find Kavafi before that. And look, this isn't anything that I haven't made clear in different interviews that I have been giving this week and earlier. To try to read Kavafi, let alone teach Kavafi, while somehow trying to repress this homosexual aspect, it's a mad, doomed project. You just can't do it. No writer writes with part of the brain on Tuesday and part of the brain on Wednesday and a different part of the brain on Thursday. All writers write with every part of themselves all the time. And so I want to be very emphatic about that. On the other hand, I'm always yelling at my gay friends in New York because they're only interested in the gay poems. Because I say, because you're not seeing the whole picture, you're not seeing the whole picture either, right? It's like the classicists I know want to read the historical poems. The gay people I know want to read the gay poems. And I think you're all crazy, right? Because you can't separate these things out, especially in Kavafi. And let me say an example. Kavafi has great insight. First of all, as we know, it's interesting that Kavafi is interested in the so-called losers of history, the ones who didn't make it, the ones who were crushed by circumstances, the one who tried to be good and it didn't do them any good, right? I have to imagine that at least in part, his understanding of and sympathy for this type of historical character arose from his own experience as a person who had the life that he had, right? So how can you, I just don't see how you could separate any of these things out.
I agree with that.
And I say the same thing, I say it on both sides. I yell at everybody, It doesn't make sense. So I think everything, if Kavafi were my national poet, I would be the happiest living person. How great to have someone that complicated in an era that is constantly interested in reducing, categorizing, labeling, shelving. Which shelf are you on at Barnes & Noble? Which shelf are you on at Eleftheroudakis? Whatever's left of it, right? That's a question that writers don't think of. That's a question that politicians think of.
You see,
and that's why I think it's incredibly important to understand what I keep referring to as the totality of Kavafi. If you try to separate one thing out, the whole thing falls apart. I feel very strongly about that.
The problem, Danny, is sometimes, can you speak about the totality all the time? And how acceptable is for people to want to speak about aspects because they find them interesting, because they find them less discussed, because they find them politically, at this moment, the things to say. Kavafi is also about those things, isn't he?
No, I totally understand that. And look, everyone reads.
Who can talk
we
about
all
totality,
read people for different reasons. I'm not stupid and I'm not naive, but I've in the past couple of weeks, I've been asked some very pointed questions on this subject, and I want to have an opportunity to be clear. My understanding of Kavafi, at least, is that everything is connected. Because in all of us, everything is connected. If somebody were reading my, 150 years from now, right, and believe me, it's not going to happen, but when they have the Mendelsohn 150th anniversary, God help me, nothing would make me more unhappy if, someone were saying, well, but you can only read Mendelssohn as a Jewish writer, or you can only read Mendelssohn as a gay writer, or you can only read...
Have you ever heard this said about Kavafi? Is anybody who says that you can only read him as a
No,
gay?
but I've been asked questions. There's clearly something going on here, right? And people say, oh, well, some of these questions I've been answering. It's like, oh, can you only read Kavafi? I don't even know what that question...
Yeah, why do people are so obsessed with that, you think?
Luckily, I get to fly back to New York on Thursday, and I don't have to...
Oh, it's something that you only get asked here?
No, but I understand that there's some kind of controversy going on, right? Is this too much gay Kavafi, whatever? Look, you know more about this than...
I don't know if I do, but I have seen so many journalists this week and the past asking you, and also last year asking you to talk about whether Kavafi is gay literature. And I actually want to know who said this phrase gay literature, and how did they, because there's one thing to give a label and another thing to be able to discuss it analytically. I mean, obviously there are people who want to talk more about homoeroticism, homosexuality as an identity claimed by people in Kavafy's poems. Also homosexuality as something that is constantly negotiated in the Kavafi archive, in the Kavafi output, in the Kavafi canon, and also about people who were gay and read Kavafi throughout the century. And these are people who are poets, who are artists, but also who are people around us who may be here and have this particular affinity in the same way that people read him as a historical poet, or Alexandrians have a special affinity for Kavafi as Alexandrians, and nobody tells them that they are reducing the poet because, for instance, they go and publish a translation or they fund a project about Kavafi because they are Alexandrians themselves. And nobody say, okay, you're Alexandrian and you want to pick this thing up, but you have to also care about all the other aspects. Who said? And I was, it is as if, you have to speak about gaydom and also castigate gaydom for reading Kavafi as gay. Would you ever castigate like a classicist for putting their own insights in the more classical
no, but I would say that
Kavafi?
No serious person is going to advocate a monochromatic reading of any great writer.
I don't think
that. I think we all agree on those, and that's why I say people who want to read that way are politicians, not readers. They think in terms of constituencies. They think in terms of who's on one side, who's on the other. I don't think to any serious scholar these are interesting concerns, but I think it needs to be. I would re-emphasize that. Particularly with Kavafi, precisely because he's interested in multiple, complicated, fluid identities, historically, erotically, ethically, certainly, philosophically. You can't pick and choose, right? I think all serious people, agree about that.
Yeah, exactly. There are texts by you, a recent text in the New Yorker, but also one of your best ever texts, The Elusive Embrace, where you talk about your own investment in texts, in times of loneliness, of personal defeat, but also of belief. There is a beautiful, beautiful piece recently that was in the New Yorker on Mary Renault, where you actually talk about yourself as a young American boy who didn't have anything else to read in order exactly to find out about and consolation about your own sexual identity, and you turned to the classical world of the novels of Mary Renault. And even though I want to apologize somehow for broaching this in the way I did, I think this is the way I mentioned the Kavafi aspect in that respect.
Yes.
There may be other people who read Kavafi in that way.
Yes, there's no question. There's no question.
I mean, we have to somehow.
I think what one wants, what's so interesting to me, and this is a point I make over and over again in my criticism of many different kinds of novels, blah, blah, whatever, is, to my mind, the whole point of literature, art of any kind, actually, is to, literature hooks us because we identify with something. But of course, the great trick that literature plays is it hooks you because you identify, and then it shows you something that's totally different, and it makes you feel connected to other things beside yourself, right? So you see what I'm saying? So to my friends who pick up Kavafi because they're gay and he's a gay poet, which is crucial. We all find, it's funny how people always find the writers that they need, like water buffalo smelling water 60 miles away. Somehow you find what you need. I've made this point, as you know, in much of my writing. You know, the trick that literature plays is that we get to see the bigger picture, right? That you may start with an author because you identify with one thing. You know, I'll tell you a story. I had a student once who started a paper, and the first line of the paper was, Madame Bovary is a great novel because it reminds me of something that happened when I was at school. And I wrote, that is not why Madame Bovary is a great novelist, you know. And what's interesting to me, and I worry about this a lot with my students, it's interesting to me, and I notice this more and more, and this may be, you know, a question getting way away from Kavafi about the sort of state of culture, that students, they tell me, oh, I couldn't get into it because I couldn't identify with it. I always think that's so, it never occurred to me to identify with Emma Bovary. You know, I mean, the whole point was that she was not me. But of course, we look for things that we identify with. But I would say, if I were being Platonic, you know, I would say that's level one of the ladder, right? I want to read a book about, you know, when when I was growing up, you're a boy, you read these Hardy Boy books about boy detectives, right? Because it gets you interested in stories or whatever. So I'm always arguing, and this is true of Kavafi also, that, you know, if you identify him with as a classicist and you want to read the historical poems, great. But hopefully, they'll take you to the other end, and vice versa. I just have to, that's me. You know, that's how I read. And I always say this, I've said this in reviews of many people, you know, the Jewish book that's only interesting to Jewish readers is a good book, but it's not a great book, right? The Greek book that's only interesting to Greek people is a good book, but not a great book. The great book is the book about Greek people that American boys can read, and they'll find something in it. This is how I think about literature. So, but I want to be very clear about this. I'm not saying that if you pick up a writer because there's something about the writer you identify, there's somehow that's bad or whatever. But that's the first step. You know, it's the human picture that all great writers are interested in, and that Kavafi is interested in.
Well, I think Kavafi has a lot to say about identification.
Yeah.
But also he keeps alluding to the fact that this is not the end of the story.
No, Kavafi always reminds you that there's always another story, the story that someone didn't get to tell.
You take a side, and then, you take a side, you realize you were on the wrong side.
Right, and Kavafi, of course, knows in the end everyone's wrong.
Yes.
Everyone's wrong. You know, no one has the total picture, right?
In a minute, I'll open to questions from the audience. So you will have to start preparing your question. Θα δώσω το λόγο σε εσάς σε ένα λεπτό για τις ερωτήσεις που ενδεχομένως έχετε. Έχουμε αρκετό χρόνο για τις ερωτήσεις.
I think we have enough time for questions.
Καθώς ετοιμάζετε τις ερωτήσεις σας, θα ρωτήσω...
And as you are preparing for your own questions, allow me to ask one last question, a question which part of the audience has actually asked me to ask to you.
To me by the audience before I open the floor to questions from the audience. And this was something that I also felt reading your masterpiece, according to many critics, that is The Lost. A book.
I thought that my masterpiece was the book I'm writing right now.
Well, let's hope somebody will ask, what is Danny doing right now? Because it's a good story too. But let's go back to The Lost. When I read that, I remember you say a lot there about yourself, searching for your relatives who were lost in the Holocaust. And I said to myself while reading, okay, Kavafi will come up I can sense, I can feel Kavafi every other page. There is something Kavafian going on. And Kavafi, I think, was not mentioned in the book. I think I even wrote an email to you at the time. And this is the question that a member of the audience also asked me to ask you. How related is your interest in Kavafi to your writing of The Lost?
Well, it's funny, I was talking about this the other day, but I think, the whole time I was writing Khamenei, I was working on the Kavafi, and so clearly there was some kind of cross-pollination taking place, and in a nutshell, I would describe it as follows. Look, we were just talking about Kavafi and his personal history, his intellectual interests, and how they pushed him in the direction of being interested in the people that history forgets. That's, I think, maybe one way. Not always, because he writes a lot about people that history remembers, but he's very interested in the problem of forgetting, the ones that get left behind. So, of course, that's what my whole book is about, really. It's how do you... Kavafi understands that so much gets lost in history, and often what we pull back, we think we understand, but we're not quite really getting it. Or maybe the wrong historian triumphs, And I would say, I think by immersing myself so deeply in Kavafi for such a long time, I had a deep appreciation of precisely the way that small lives, ordinary lives, get bulldozed by history, and how important it is and what an ethical imperative it is to try to recuperate lost lives for people who don't get to tell their own story anymore. I think that's right. It's funny because the first poems of Kavafi, interestingly enough, that I had a strong response to were the Taphos poems, because I think it's so poignant, that some people only get to speak when they are dead, and then the only thing that is left of them is what the tombstone says. But of course, the point of so many of Kavafi's poems, called Taphos, whoever, is that the reality of the person seems to have been quite richer than what the tombstone is able to tell you, even if they wrote the inscription themselves. So I think I became very wrapped up in this very Kavafian question of who writes the stories, who tells the stories, whose stories survive, whose stories never get told. And that obviously had a big effect on me. I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't think I was thinking about Kavafi. This is precisely what I was talking about before, right? I thought I was writing with my Jewish head, but it turns out I was writing with my Kavafian head. That's exactly, I rest my case, right? So I thought I knew what I was doing, and that's why you need the total Mendelsohn picture, right? To understand one book, which is not as great as one poem of Kavafi, right? So you see how that works? We have many aspects, and all of them come into play when we write, and we don't even know about them.
I'll tell you reader's response to that. When I was reading, there are many moving parts in The Lost, but there is, towards the end, you find out the story of each and every one of the 6 million, or almost all. So you get told the story, you find out about how they died, and you keep persisting to find out exactly how they died, which is part of the book, is that persistence. And towards the end, you want to go in the place where some of them perished, in the place where they were hiding, in the place, to go out there, and you insist, and you persist, and everybody tells you, we cannot find it, or it is there, but then you find out it's not there. But in the end, you go there in that small cell or pit, whatever it was, and you want to go in there. And when I was first reading it, I thought, this is Kavafi, and he never goes out. He never goes out to do that. But then I thought, you know what? Sometimes he touches a tombstone. Mm-hmm. And sometimes he tries to do with his body whatever remembering there is. So there you go, you know, two different readings, and you reaching out, and Kavafi. I found that a great, I don't know, it's a great, I thought it was an un-Kavafian moment, and then again, perhaps too Kavafian for me to understand, you know. This is the one where I turn to you, and whatever questions you have, you can ask in either Greek or English. I think I'll translate into English just for, but Danny also speaks Greek.
My problem is always that Greek speaks so fast.
That's why we are here, to simplify that. I would, though, ask you please to be as brief as you can. And for the time management of this conversation, I would, and if you agree, I would like to take 2 or 3 questions at one time, and then we go to the next round. So if I have the first 2 or 3 questions, and mind you, if you don't ask, I will keep asking, so you have an interest in asking.
Hi. Okay, you listen to me. Hi, thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak to you. I was struck by something you said. You said that if a Greek story is only good for Greeks, and an American cannot identify with it, then it's not good enough, or it's good enough for Greeks, but it could be better. Or a Jewish story that if it's only good for Jews, but an American cannot identify with it, then okay, it's a good story, but it's not good enough. And I was struck by that because I think there are Greek stories that an American person cannot identify with that are great in their own worth. You know, I mean, that means something for, or let's say a Kenyan story may mean a lot for someone who was born in that landscape, mental landscape or geographical landscape. And me as a Greek, because I don't have that experience, because I'm not there, it may mean nothing to me, but it doesn't mean it's not a great work. And starting from that point, I would like to ask you, do you really think that Kavafi really cared about being so ecumenical? Because it doesn't seem to me, from reading him, that he cared about being so ecumenical, that he really cared about being this sort of a poet that everybody can identify with. I don't think this was his interest.
It was more than one question, so you can answer now. You answered the first triplet.
Να τη μεταφράσω στα ελληνικά, γιατί... έχει μετά.
No, there is translation. Whoever had translation has still the thing on.
Well, no, but I mean, my point is that, no, so Kavafi certainly didn't care. Look, Kavafi is writing about often such recherché subject matter, you know, it's almost perverse. But my point is that whatever the writer thinks that she or he is doing isn't the case. That I do believe, and we may just disagree about this, that what we respond to in great art is a human element that transcends specific categories. So Kavafi may write poems about, well, I can't think of a single historical character that he wrote about. You know, John Cantacuzénos, right? That an American person has no idea who he is. But the ethic of the poem, the human element of the poem, the message of the poem is something that everyone understands, right? Of colored glass, right? As somebody who is so noble that he doesn't care that the coronation jewels are made of glass, that's making an ethical point that is apprehensible to anybody. So I would push back a little bit and say that if the story that you're telling cannot find some point of identification to a person from another culture, then it is insufficiently connecting to a larger human thing. I really believe that. I really do.
There was a question back there, I think. Is there still a question back there? Yes. No, they wait for the mic. And then the next question is coming from there. Okay. Keep your hand up. You will take 2 questions now.
Yes. The fact that Kavafi has chosen the losers of history, let's say, brackets, shows from his part weakness or strength?
Weakness or?
Strength. Was he strong? Was he feeling strong? And he has chosen the losers because he wanted to make a shout that there is strength in the losers. This is my opinion.
Okay.
I think the losers have a strong personality because they face the situations and the difficulties.
Okay, and the next question is coming from there.
Since I have been a teacher and poetry has given me a hard time in terms of it being taught to my students. Whenever I would teach poetry, at first it was hard for my students to grasp, and in most cases my students would ask about the meaning.
And the question is that often when you teach Kavafi, you come up with this question from students: what does the poet want to say?
Όταν έδινε εξετάσεις, θυμάμαι τότε.
And whenever we took tests and exams back then, I recall we were always given a test on Ithaca or a Kavafi poem. You see, he was always there, regardless of us being knowledgeable or not. Kavafi was always there. What I'm driving at is this: you embarked upon a scientific or a scholarly field, and you had to analyze the texts. Allow me to go so far as to say that you're being apologetic to a certain extent, and critics quite often, I'm not downplaying on your role, maybe critics are there to uncover and discover things, and maybe they can help you in your work. For example, Argyri was a civil engineer. What I'm driving at is this: what sort of skills and capacities do I have myself when this is a crossword puzzle and it's a poem and I have to fathom what it is all about? If I had to read about Ioannis Katakouzinos and Kavafis was there, maybe he would be in a position to explain what the meaning is. And then from a biographical point of view, do not forget that Kavafi was also a stockbroker. Well, he also worked for the stock exchange for a while. And I read an article in the newspaper back in Saturday, and I was unhappy by the fact that I read this article according to which he was just a simple clerk. Thank you. Should there be a third question, or rather, if you have any more questions, please.
Starting from how difficult it is to basically interpret Kavafi, ended up saying that a reader actually needs help. Often a reader needs help and needs all that kind of critical apparatus in order to critical work in order to be helped. The second question was biographical, whether Kavafi was very active, say, in the stock market and not just an unknown clerk, which I don't think, nobody is unknown, in one's life. Everybody makes their point and their mark. I want a third question. You keep
can we just do 2 at a time, because I can't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning.
Okay, then.
Okay, I don't even remember. Oh, strength or weakness? Okay. See, I'm not lying.
If you want, you can take one.
I mean, to me, it seems that a writer who focuses on the so-called losers, right, it has to be coming from a place of tremendous strength. I mean, everybody wants to honor the winners. That's the easy thing. I mean, to focus on the forgotten, the ones who didn't win, the ones who resigned, the ones who knew what the right time was to walk away without making a fuss. I think one has to have a tremendous ethical solidity to do that, I think. And again, I think, as I said earlier on, I think it comes from his own sense of isolation, but I don't want the word isolation to have a bad overtone. I think he feels alone. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he's interested in. And that's what he's going to write about. And so I think it comes from a tremendous kind of inner strength. And one of the most exciting things about working on Kavafi is to watch him developing that strength. You know, Seferi said that Kavafi started out as a mediocre poet, and he's right. You know, apropos of translation, I wanted to say before that, in fact, the only easy poems of Kavafi to translate are the early ones, which are not so great.
Yep.
Mediocre poetry is much easier to translate than great poetry. That's something I learned. And one of the most interesting, you know, it's so derivative, it's so influenced by the Parnasse, by Baudelaire, by all these people. He's imitating other people's voices. And one of the most interesting things about working on Kavafi is to watch his own confidence in his own vision emerging in the course of his career. It's something you get to witness on the page, because we have early poems and we have middle poems and we have late poems, and it's a thrilling thing to watch happen. You see him deciding at a certain moment that he's going to be tough with himself and serious, and after a certain point everything is great, but that comes from strength. You know, so that's how I would answer that question. And now I forgot the second question.
The second question is, do we always need commentary?
No.
Gentleman said, you know, I need somebody to tell me. There's so much there that I don't know.
Well, but you know, I need commentary to read Callimachus. Doesn't make Callimachus a worse poet. Makes me a worse reader, maybe. You know, some poems yes, some poems no. Look, there was a review of my translation in an English newspaper, and they say, oh, you know, Kavafi, he flies free of even the most well-meaning commentary. So I thought, okay, you don't want to read the commentary, don't read the commentary. I mean, it depends. If I were teaching, look, I taught Kavafi and I used a commentary. So, but I don't think, there are many poems of Kavafi that you don't need notes to understand. And again, hopefully people read those poems and they want to know what the Kantekusenos poems are, and then they're going to have to read a note, but then they get it, and then how great is that?
Yeah.
Right? That's how we all become readers. And there was the biographical question, which I can't remember. What was the final?
Often he's presented as not, you know, a clerk, even though he did other things and he played in the stock market and he was very active. Isn't it a little bit unfair to think of him as a lonely clerk, not very important?
No, I don't think, as I said before, when I talk about the isolation of Kavafi, I'm not talking about the actual man, I'm talking about a sort of intellectual event. I mean, we know about, you know, there are descriptions of evenings at his house and what a colorful talker he is and how, but, you know, so I think you're right, you know, if he played the stock market or played tennis or whatever he played, you know, great, but I think we need to also, particularly as time passes, we need to separate Kavafi the person with a biographical life from Kavafi the artist who has a certain personality. I mean, look, this is one of the great mysteries of art, which is that people who are great artists can be terrible people, horrible people, as we know, right? Or they can be unexciting. That's one of the great mysteries. I always thought somebody should write a dissertation on poets with terrible day jobs. You know, there's a whole bunch of poets, you know, who have histories of having these very boring jobs, insurance clerks, irrigation, whatever, you know. Maybe that's the way to be a great poet. Get a boring job, you know.
Okay, there is... let your questions be, if your questions are brief, we can have pretty much everything that I see here. So 1, 2, 3. Try 3 this time. Because yeah, please.
Hi.
It's here.
Over here.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
She was my student.
First
Hi,
of all,
Chloe.
Well, I was wondering if you have an editor for your poems.
I'm sorry?
If you have an editor.
Did I have an editor?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, here's...
Yeah.
Is this a trick question?
That's an easy
question. Did you know something we don't...
It's just on the process of translation. Because from what I've understood, it's a very intimate relationship that you develop with the writer you're translating that evolves over the course of 10, 12 years. And so how is that influenced? To what extent when a third party comes in?
Well, it's actually interesting. So I had an editor, an actual editor at the publishing company who edits a lot of poetry, but she doesn't know Greek. So she's useful in certain ways, very useful in certain ways. But of course, the thing about a translation, finally, is that it has to sound right in the language you're translating into. Poetry, there are poetry contests, translation contests that are judged by people who don't know both languages, She was very useful for the... So in that sense, yes. Then there were certain other people to whom I showed my translation. 2 other people who know Greek intimately, and who then also historians that I shared it with. So I was looking at a lot of angles. But at a certain point, it's your own, your own feeling. There's a prominent American poet who doesn't know Greek, but who loves Kavafi. So you get enough input that it's like, it's like sandpapering a rough piece of wood, right? And then you hope for the best. Then someone reviews it and they pick the one really terrible mistake that you didn't think you thought you were doing something so brilliant, and it turned out it wasn't so great. C'est la vie, right? Nothing is perfect. So I would say that as a critic, it's always important to remember there are no perfect books. That's not what you're aiming for, but you get a lot of help. Who are we looking at?
Okay, one question here, then the question there, and then we have time for another 2 questions.
I
think that it was Wittgenstein who said, it's my language and it's my world. Correct me if I'm wrong. Mr. Mendelsohn, I've read your book, Lost, that is.
American with Jewish background. Your world is different than mine, by definition. My experiences, my life, my surroundings, my geographical environment. Do you have to be a poet to be a good translator of poetry if your world is so different than mine, or than Kavafi's for that matter?
Can we take another question?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that is I hope not. Okay, but let me hold that, and we'll get one more, and then I'll come back and answer you seriously.
It's all right.
Ο Τίμος Μαλάνος, που έχει γράψει για τον Καβάφη, στο έργο του, Καβάφης, και ο οποίος ήταν σύγχρονος.
And Timos was actually a man who lived at the same time as Kavafi, and he was also a critic, poetry critic and a poet himself. He said that it was not just his erotic poems, but all of the work of Kavafi, including historical, philosophical poems, they all focused on his homosexuality. What do you think of this?
Question, did you get it? That every aspect of Kavafi, well, he says that, but he also says, starts from his repressed, or his homosexuality, less repressed by the time. There is a question, are you okay? Okay, do you want to answer those?
So let's start with the easier question.
Okay.
This gentleman. I sometimes think that the great discovery in Kavafi's studies will be the notes of his psychotherapist, and then all of our problems will be solved. I must say that I'm aware of this question and this issue in Cavafian studies. To me, again, I'm going to respond to this question as a writer more than as a translator or a critic, which is that I wouldn't want anyone reading me that way. You know, I think one of the problems of being post-Freudian is we attach such a tremendous weight of importance to the sex life. And I wouldn't underplay the importance of the sex, but people are composed of many aspects. And I think, so as I have said myself before in this conversation, I certainly think Kavafi's sexuality, his experience, which we dimly have evidence of, must have informed his vision. How could it not? You know, but other things inform your vision too. You know, what kind of, you know, your intellectual interests, your social life, your, you know, so I personally tend not to, I think I tend to resist this, you know, everything's about the repressed sexuality, because I actually, or maybe not repressed sexuality, that's not how I read, because I think people have all, again, as I keep saying, people have many aspects. So I'm leery of that. But again, I would emphasize, I would not underplay the connection of his erotic life, his life as a person who had to repress himself at certain moments, undoubtedly. I'm sure in my own work the same thing is true, right? You know, what you want in a critic is someone who can look at the picture and achieve a useful balance, I would say. This is a personal thing, totally personal. You know, also these things are being written at an age where there's a great kind of excitement about Freudian interpretations, blah, blah, blah. You know, even histories of interpretations have histories, as we know. You know, once it was all about the mother, then it was all about the father, then it was all about, you know, so one has to take it with a grain of salt. Now, does a good translator have to be a good poet? I would just say on the, you know, I'm not going to answer this question about my own translation, but certainly there are wonderful translations of people who are not great poets. I mean, it can happen. So.
What I meant is it a new poem what you or Edmund Lee?
Keeley.
That's what I'm asking.
Is it a new poem? Yes, because look, every translation is going to create something, you know, as it were, slightly to the left of the original or slightly behind. Of course, it's always new. You hope for the best. That's all I can say.
And as we prepare for the next question, let me say that next Tuesday there will be a discussion here on the erotic Kavafi. And we can discuss that, because Melanos' view is not the only view, and it's very much of its time, right? It's not the only view that talks about sexuality and eroticism in Kavafi.
Right.
He insisted in a specific way that is period-specific, very, pseudo-Freudian, you could say. But come next Tuesday, and this will be... We have a question there. Okay.
Είναι προσωπική ερώτηση. Είστε ένας διανοούμενος με...
This is a personal question. You are an intellectual with a wide range of interests. You don't just care about philology, letters, and poetry. I have this question for you. Since you have cohabitated with Kavafis, you've worked on Kavafis for 12 years, you also were looking for your Jewish relatives throughout Europe, while you also had your own review on Troy, you wrote your own criticism on the Game of Thrones, you're in touch with pop culture and quote-unquote low culture. Given that you are working on these fields, I have this question for you. Do you feel like you have a split personality? And then is somehow one culture irrigating or poisoning the other?
Okay, I'll help you. I know you understood, but you are an intellectual with broad interests. You spent 12 years with Kavafi translating, as many years searching for your relatives and writing about that but you also write on Troy, on Game of Thrones, on Mad Men, on the Titanic myth. Is this a split personality we're talking about, or is it an intellectual who takes popular culture, high culture, middle-brow culture, and tries to inform, to sort of play them around in a way that each one reads the other?
Well, I'm interested in a lot of things. I always like to say that it's my training as a classicist that allowed me to do this. By which I mean that when you are looking at classical culture, you're looking at a totality of a civilization, right? You're looking at tragedy, you're looking at lyric poetry, you're looking at very scatological comedy, you're looking at strange rituals, you're looking at people's pots and pans, so you learn to, as it were, read a culture in its totality. And you develop excellent tools for doing that. So I always say that, I'm interested in my culture, and my culture consists of many things, and why not? I try to be interested in everything. I try not to have snobberies. I try not to... Look, everybody went to Greek tragedy, not just the college professors, right? It was a popular phenomenon, so one has to understand that. And I feel very strongly about this. So it may also be the case that I have a split personality, but, but I don't think that I do. I just think that I'm...
There will be a Melanos writing about you one day.
Yes, I'm sure he's writing about my sexual repression right now.
Okay, now it will be time, unfortunately, for last questions. And if possible, I'll ask your help with that. Let's take 3 brief questions. The reason being that I have seen at least 3 people waving hands, not drowning, but waving. 1, 2, 3, I'm afraid. Let them be brief, and they are the last questions.
Yeah. How do you respond to people who, although they acknowledge some considerable poetical value to Kavafis, they somehow look down at him for being a decadent poet, and I do not mean by that a homosexual. These were dinosaurs. I mean, a decadent poet in a sense that he has not much of elan vital in him, that he is not the vital force to, he is kind of resigned, etc. And 2, people who classify him as a poet of a minor key, not having the sense of sublime that Solomos has and Elitis has. So how do you respond to this?
The romantics in general. Okay, I'll remind you if you forget. Another one, because the lady, and then
Thank you very much, because I was in Alexandria as a teacher with Kostin Moskov, and I was following all this symposium, and I learned this evening many new things you gave me. I have to tell you 3 questions. The one is...
Oh, my God.
Very short question. First is, I'm surprising at the time why Kavafi didn't take care of what happened in Azimineru, Smyrna, Catastrophe Smyrnis Festival. The time, it was very important for not only the Greeks, for everybody. That's one question in my mind.
Will the other 2 be that small? Because this is a huge question.
The other question is, as you are intellectual, do you find any connection with Holocaustoma, with the crisis at the moment Greece passed? Do you think that we have some common things and we need a help for the whole world because of Kavafi, this yes of Kavafi? Thank you.
Okay, let me ask, before we go, and I think you will answer now because there are too many. Could I have a sign from the director? Could we take another 5 minutes before we... There is no sign from the director, so I think we can. Okay,
because those questions will only take a few seconds.
All right. Okay. So the question there, is he a minor key poet and is he a decadent poet?
You know, I never get in arguments about, you know, people. You know, I'm not Kavafi's agent. I don't get a percentage, you know. So I always feel like, you know, people say, oh, he's decadent, he looks backwards, he doesn't show a good lesson for gay marriage, whatever. You know, you know, if you don't like Kavafi, don't read him.
Yep.
That's I don't see the point in response. But I mean, I take your question seriously, but I mean, so somebody, you know, is he minor? So here's how I'm going to answer that question. Yes, Kavafi is minor because he only cares about time, history, desire, personality, you know, yeah, right. I don't even know what to say about that, you know, and say, I was reading in the paper and somebody said, well, you know, he looks backwards, he doesn't provide an optimistic model. I said, have you read history lately? You know, so I don't know, you know, that's what I say, you know, you can write a book and you can call it Why I Don't Like Kavafi, but I don't find it a useful argument. I think those of us who have worked on Kavafi in all different ways. Look, one of the things you know from scholarship, everyone has different ways, but it obviously means a lot to a lot of intelligent people. So that's my answer. I'm not going to get into a contest of trying to prove that he's a good poet if you don't like him. I just don't see the point. Now, to get to these very easy questions that this lady posed for
Asia
me.
Minor.
The what?
Asia Minor. Asia Minor. He's a poet who was writing during the catastrophe, during the Second and First World War.
Okay, so here's what I have to say about Kavafi and current events.
And then
there's different ways to write a poem about 1922, right? One of them, you could write a poem about 1922. Another one is you can write a poem about a lot of political figures in the past making really stupid decisions. That's another way of writing a poem about current events, right? Kavafi, you know, we were talking a little bit yesterday about, at this group interview, about is Kavafi political? And I say, you know, yes, he's political in a politics much larger than any one event, right? So what does he care about? He cares about powerful people who are self-deluded and cannot see what's right in front of their face. That's a theme in Kavafi, and I would dare say it's a political theme, right? You know, so you know, just because he didn't write an editorial to the paper saying, you know, something about what's going on, doesn't mean that he's not both reacting to and inspired by what was happening. You know, Kavafi read the newspapers, but, you know, you can't, I always think it's a dead end to blame writers for not having written what you wanted them to write, in a certain sense. But I do think, you know, I have, I don't want to go into it, but I had a small theory about why Kavafi was writing so many poems, or a number of poems, about Ioannis Kantikouzenos in the early 1920s. You know, I think it was partly inspired by, you know, so Kavafi is interested in history, so he's going to write poems about history. It doesn't mean they can't be about the present. And you know, I think any more than that I wouldn't say, but I think Kavafi is deeply political. Look, we've got books about the political Kavafi. There's all different ways of thinking about that. I think that's worth thinking about. Yeah. You know, but anybody who writes that many poems about stupid leaders is not apolitical.
I did promise the last question to the lady back there, but before we get to that, you understand, Danny, that we are having this discussion in a very difficult time. Both
yes, I also read the newspapers.
And I don't know if you have a feeling that even the way we are asking you about Kavafi, or we want to engage with you as an intellectual, a global intellectual, or with Kavafi for the matter, is somehow in that frame as well. I don't know if you...
No, I understand that. Look, I was doing interviews before I came here, and they say, what can a Kavafi tell us about the political crisis? You know, again, I'm not, as an American, am not going to lecture a Greek audience about how to read their own poets. That's crazy. On the other hand, this is a poet I love, I think is very important, has changed my life, changed my way of thinking about history, has enriched my vision of so many things. And I think, you know, if you read him carefully, he tells you a lot about the present. And I don't know what else to say, you know. I would say one of the most interesting things about Kavafi is the double vision, what I think of as the double vision. You know, on the one hand, he can be so ironic, so acerbic, so almost bitter about history. On the other hand, he can be feeling and sentimental, and that's so moving, you know, his feeling. And, you know, he's so many... as I said before, I would be so happy if he were my national poet, because what one always wants is a more complicated vision, not a less complicated vision. And I think that is a way of thinking about the current situation, you know.
I did promise the last question to the lady back there, and then I have a favor to ask, and then... I'm sorry. Yeah, the crisis is exactly what we just covered, and I'm pressed for time, and I want to go to that question back there.
I'll make it very, very brief, I promise you. My question has to do with his very, very early poems that were written in English, and they're usually poems about what was then Constantinople, which he briefly lived in. And I remember you saying in New York, because I was there listening to you talk, that one of the ways that his poetry matured was by cutting away adjectives from his old poems, for example, or adverbs, and cleaning up his poetry. And it seems to me that in the early, very immature, in a sense, English poems, this type of poetry, the non-adjective, non-adverbial poetry still exists. Do you feel like that? Do you feel that there is a kernel there in his English poems that gets mirrored and upgraded in his much later brilliant, mature poetry?
This is a very Kavafian way to end, a very technical question. Because sometimes it's all about technique, you know.
Does
the early poet, yeah, early English.
Well, I mean, what I will say, that's not a question I'm going to answer on the fly, but it's interesting to think about. You know, we know that he wrote poems in other languages, and his multilinguality, I think, is a subject worth thinking about. You know, one of the interesting things about working on Kavafi is working on a translation of Kavafi is that you're translating a poet who knew English as well as he knew anything practically, you know, so there's that sort of oddness. What I'm going to think about that, but I do want to come back to a point you made en route, which is Kavafi's process of becoming a better poet. And I want to invite you all to read two poems, which is Sweet Voices and then Voices. And that charts one of the most extraordinary instances that I am aware of in world literature of self-editing and learning how to trim one's own work. Because one of the things that happens from the early version of that poem to the late version is every adjective and adverb gets cut. You know, and I think it's one of the most remarkable things to watch him realize what he doesn't, you know, all writers get better by learning what they can do without. And if you read these two poems side by side, it's one of the most amazing things. I'll think about your question about the languages, but you know, I'm having a philological moment, and I don't want to go out and say something that I'm going to regret later, but thank you for the question, because it's very provocative. Thank you.
Those of you who are watching this on the internet cannot see what I have seen, how many people in the audience want to ask more questions, but unfortunately we don't have time for that.
And I would say also for the internet audience that they are not all my mother, which is usually the case.
It has been a discussion I learned so much from, as I have so much from you in our conversations, but also from your texts. I remind you that this was a discussion where we talked about time, Kavafian history, difference, distance, fluidity, care, textuality, sexuality, and now crisis and process. And over these weeks, as Greeks were preparing themselves for your visit, and Greek newspapers had many interviews and columns about you, I sensed this. People do understand your deep engagement with this Kavafi project, as well as your other projects. And I think they have responded to that. As we talked so much about care and process, it was care and process that came time and again in those interviews and in those columns. And it may be one of the characteristics of these poets. I keep saying, you know, a similar thing all evening, but I do believe that he draws us in, and we have appreciated this in you, and in your work. I obviously want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank the Stegi Γραμμάτων και Τεχνών and everyone involved for making this happen, especially Theodoris Chiotis, Aphrodite Panagiotakou, who were very much in it from the beginning. And I have a last favor to ask. As we draw this to a close, would you care to read us a poem? Your favorite Kavafian poem, perhaps, in Greek?
My favorite Kavafi poem is Aptesenia.
Well, would you? Do you want to?
12 και μισή. Γρήγορα πέρασαν η ώρα απ' τεσσενιά που ανάψα τη λάμπα και κάθισα εδώ. Κάθουμουν χωρίς να διαβάζω και χωρίς να μιλώ. Με ποιον να μιλήσω κατάμονος μέσα στο σπίτι αυτό. Το είδωλο του νέου σώματός μου απ' τεσσενιά που ανάψα τη λάμπα ήρθε και με ήβρε και με θύμισε κλειστές κάμαρες αρωματισμένες και περασμένη ειδονή, τη τολμηρή ειδονή. Και επίσης με έφερε στα μάτια εμπρός δρόμους που τώρα έγιναν αγνώριστοι. Κέντρα γεμάτα κίνηση που τέλεψαν. Και θέατρα και καφενεία που ήσαν μια φορά. Το είδωλο του νέου σώματός μου ήρθε και με έφερε και τα λυπητερά. Πένθη της οικογένειας, χωρισμοί, αισθήματα δικών μου, αισθήματα των πεθαμένων τόσο λίγο εκτιμηθέντα. 12 και μισή, πως πέρασαν η ώρα, 12 και μισή, πως πέρασαν τα χρόνια.
That was the moment. Σας ευχαριστούμε που ήσασταν εδώ.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. The events that will be hosted by stegi for Kavafi will go on. You can log on the web to find out more about upcoming events.